A smug liberal pianist mocked Keanu Reeves in front of Hollywood's elite, daring him to touch a piano, expecting silence or humiliation. But what followed wasn't a performance. It was a revelation that left the room breathless. Why did one song change everything? And what secret did Keanu bury behind those keys? Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. Keanu Reeves wasn't planning to go out that night. He'd just flown back from New York after visiting a children's hospice, privately, with no cameras and no press. The idea of dressing up and walking into a ballroom filled with celebrities, flashing cameras, and Hollywood egos didn't appeal to him. But an old friend had called, a retired composer named Howard Klein, begging Keanu to show up, just for a few minutes. The charity gala supported a music foundation for underprivileged children, one Keanu had quietly funded for years. No one knew that. He never wanted them to. So when he walked into the Beverly Hills Grand Ballroom that evening, he did it without fanfare. No red carpet entrance, no stylist, no entourage. Just a black suit, scuffed boots, and that quiet energy he always carried. Humble, observant, grounded. The room was already buzzing. Champagne flutes clinked, laughter echoed off marble columns, and a string quartet played soft jazz beneath a crystal chandelier. It was a typical LA event, a swirl of influencers in designer gowns, entertainment executives with calculated smiles, and journalists subtly scanning the crowd for someone to provoke. In the center of the ballroom, untouched, was a gleaming Steinway grand piano. Its polished surface reflected the lights overhead, waiting like a silent centerpiece for a moment that hadn't yet arrived. Keanu moved quietly, slipping through the crowd without trying to draw attention. A few people did a double take. Whispers of, "Is that Keanu Reeves?" floated behind him. But he simply smiled and kept walking. He wasn't here to make a statement. He was here for the kids. Howard found him near the silent auction table. "You came," he said, beaming. Keanu hugged the older man. "Of course. You always pull me in." Howard's eyes twinkled. "I told them you'd show. They didn't believe me. I told them you have more heart than half the donors in this place." Keanu chuckled softly. "Just don't put me in front of a microphone." But even as they talked, Keanu felt it, the way certain eyes lingered. Not admiration, curiosity, judgment. Especially from a small group by the piano, where a young musician with slicked-back hair and sharp features leaned casually on the lid. His name was Sasha Varela, a rising star in the LA classical scene. He was brilliant, technically flawless, and well known for his vocal disdain of anyone he considered an outsider to the arts. To him, Keanu was Hollywood, a face, not a soul. As Keanu passed by, Sasha's voice rang out with a smirk. "Didn't expect to see John Wick at a gala for musicians?" A few people chuckled nervously. Keanu turned slightly, offering a polite nod, then walked on. He'd heard worse. It didn't matter. But Sasha wasn't finished. His voice carried just enough volume to draw attention. "I hear you've funded this place. Funny, I didn't know action stars cared about classical music." This time, a few heads turned. Keanu paused, glancing over his shoulder. There was no malice in his eyes, just calm. "Music belongs to everyone," he said simply. Sasha raised an eyebrow. "Does it? Maybe you'd like to prove it." He motioned to the piano. "You play?" Keanu didn't answer. The moment passed, or at least it seemed to. Keanu returned to Howard, who shook his head. "Ignore him. His ego's louder than his chords." Still, the tension lingered. Throughout the evening, Keanu stayed on the edges. He listened to speeches, posed for a few photos with donors, and slipped in a quiet donation without his name attached. But Sasha kept watching him. That smug glint in his eye never faded. At one point, during a lull in the evening, Sasha sat at the piano and began playing a piece by Liszt, fast, fiery, flawless. The crowd applauded, impressed. But when he finished, Sasha looked straight at Keanu and called out, "Your turn, Mr. Reeves. Unless you're more of a spectator than a supporter." A hush fell. It wasn't the challenge itself. It was the tone. Mocking. Arrogant. Like a test he expected Keanu to fail. Keanu looked at Howard. The older man's face was pale. "You don't have to," he whispered. Keanu didn't move. His hands stayed in his pockets. He just smiled, faintly. But something in his eyes had changed. Something Sasha didn't notice. Something the room was about to feel. And the piano? Still waiting. Waiting for someone who didn't come to perform, but who might just remind everyone why silence, sometimes, hides the greatest music of all. The room glowed with soft chandeliers and muted elegance, the quiet hum of conversations weaving between clinking glasses and polished smiles. Keanu Reeves stood by the edge of the ballroom floor, tucked just behind a golden pillar, speaking softly with a child from the foundation and her mother. He was smiling, but his posture remained humble, slightly hunched, as if trying to shrink inside a world that always tried to expand him. The charity gala had grown louder as the night progressed. More champagne, more speeches, and then more ego. The grand piano in the center of the room had remained untouched for hours. A Steinway, its black lacquer reflecting the chandeliers above, almost seemed to wait, until Ethan Caldwell arrived. The energy changed the moment Ethan stepped in. With his long velvet jacket, sculpted hair, and devil-may-care swagger, Ethan didn't just walk, he performed. Known as a liberal firebrand in the music world, he had a reputation for blending politics into everything he did. Satirical concerts, anti-elite anthems, provocative interviews, and yet, here he was, among the very crowd he often ridiculed. His eyes scanned the ballroom, then locked onto Keanu. A sly grin crossed his lips. He grabbed a flute of champagne from a waiter, stepped up to the microphone near the stage and cleared his throat, loudly. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice echoing through the high-ceilinged ballroom. "I know this is a music gala and not a movie set, but it looks like we have a Hollywood legend in our midst." All eyes turned. Keanu glanced up slowly. The child next to him held his hand tighter. "Keanu Reeves," Ethan continued, bowing with theatrical flair. "An actor of many faces, silent, stoic, mysterious," he chuckled. "But tonight, I wonder, can he be musical?" A ripple of laughter ran through the crowd. Confused chuckles, hesitant amusement. Keanu's expression didn't change. He stayed still, nodding once in polite acknowledgement, then looking back to the child beside him. But Ethan wasn't done. He walked toward the piano, trailing his fingers along the top. We've seen him take down villains, drive motorcycles through fire, save the world a dozen times over. But can he play a C major scale? More laughter, louder this time. Keanu's jaw tightened just slightly. Ethan sat at the piano with exaggerated confidence and cracked his knuckles. "You see, it's easy to pretend in front of cameras. A little editing, a few takes, and voila, you're a genius. But real talent?" He played a rapid, flashy arpeggio with flair. "That's different." People began to pull out their phones. Ethan leaned toward the mic again. "So, what do you say, Keanu? Let's see what you've got. Or is the piano just a prop, on your way to another photo op?" Whispers filled the room now. Someone near the front whispered, "Is he serious?" Another murmured, "He's trying to humiliate him." Keanu gently stepped forward, releasing the child's hand and giving her a gentle smile. "I didn't come here for a performance," he said softly but clearly, "just to support the kids." Ethan laughed. "Oh, of course, the noble, humble excuse. You support them from the shadows, right? Like Batman, but with fewer notes." It was cruel, but it got what Ethan wanted. Now nearly every phone in the room was pointed in their direction. A woman near the backstage whispered, "If he walks away, Ethan wins." Another said, He's not a musician. This is so unfair. Ethan turned back to the keys, starting into a wild, technically impressive jazz medley, his fingers flying, head bobbing, the room now filled with dramatic flourishes and artificial fire. He wasn't playing from the heart. He was performing war. When he ended with a final chord slammed so hard it rattled the chandelier bulbs, Ethan stood and gave a mocking bow. "Your move, Mr. Reeves," he said with a smile too wide, too sharp. Keanu didn't move at first. He looked down at his shoes, then up at the crowd. He wasn't angry. He was disappointed. The music gala, the one meant to raise money for instruments, for art education, for children without voices, had become someone's stage for self-glorification. A mockery, not of Keanu, but of the entire purpose of the night. Ethan raised his eyebrows, smug. "Come on, you've got all these people watching. Surely the real-life action hero has a few notes in him." Keanu's fingers twitched at his side. A flash of memory returned to him, his mother years ago, showing him how to find middle C on the piano they couldn't afford to tune. He'd loved the sound, not because he was good, but because it gave him peace. In between auditions, in between jobs, in between pain. He looked toward the piano now. It wasn't just a symbol anymore. It was a question. Not from Ethan, but from himself. Would he let someone else define what he could or couldn't do? He turned toward the crowd, giving the child beside him a quick smile. And then he walked to the piano. A hush fell. Ethan blinked, clearly surprised. Keanu stood beside the bench, but didn't sit. He ran his fingers gently across the top, then looked up. "I'm not a concert pianist," he said, his voice still soft. "I'm not here to impress anyone. But I do believe in the power of music, and I won't let anyone turn it into a weapon." And with that, he sat down. Bones stayed up. He took a breath and placed his hands on the keys. He didn't play fast. He didn't show off. But the melody that came, a simple, slow rendition of Debussy's Clair de Lune, wrapped the room in stillness. There were flaws, notes slightly off, but there was something in it Ethan hadn't expected. Emotion, realness. Keanu wasn't trying to win, he was simply playing. And that, more than any flashy display, began to shift the room. Some lowered their phones. Some leaned forward. Even Ethan, arms crossed, seemed unsure how to respond. The problem was no longer just a mockery. It had become a test. Not of skill, but of heart. And Keanu, without saying a word, was already passing it. The silence in the ballroom was no longer just awkward. It was oppressive. People stood still, wine glasses frozen halfway to their lips. The once buzzing crowd had dissolved into a sea of hushed anticipation. Ethan Caldwell leaned smugly against the piano bench, still basking in the afterglow of his dramatic, attention-hungry performance. But all eyes had shifted to Keanu Reeves. Keanu stood at the edge of the crowd, his expression unreadable. The echo of Ethan's taunt still hung in the air like the last note of a symphony. The kind that didn't resolve. "We all know you act, but can you actually do anything real? Like music?" It hadn't been a joke, not really. It had been a challenge, a public one, a setup disguised as satire. And now the crowd waited, some hoping he'd rise, others silently praying he'd retreat. Phones were out, the internet was already watching. But Keanu didn't flinch. He didn't return the insult. He never did. Instead, he closed his eyes. And somewhere in the dim quiet of that Beverly Hills ballroom, a memory stirred. He was 11 again, sitting cross-legged on the scuffed floor of a modest apartment in Toronto. The windows rattled when the subway passed, and the piano, an old upright Yamaha, was slightly out of tune. His mother, Patricia, had placed his hands on the keys, guiding him through Clair de Lune. "You don't need to be loud to be heard," she'd whispered. "Just be honest." Music had been his sanctuary. Back then, before the movies, before the fame, before the weight of loss and public scrutiny, Keanu had spent hours tucked into the piano bench, finding melodies that made the chaos fade. Each note was a retreat, a shield against the instability around him. Music was never about performance, it was about peace. At 16, he'd memorized Chopin's Ballade No. 1, playing it on rainy days in his bedroom, the sound of the keys his only company. But then came the crash. A best friend, David, the one who always hummed along with him, died in a motorcycle accident. Keanu was 17. Everything changed. He stopped playing. Cold. He locked the lid of the Yamaha and never touched it again. It was too painful, too raw, and eventually acting became his focus. The silence of music left behind. Until now. Back in the ballroom, Marcus Lang, his longtime friend and quiet protector, stepped beside him. His voice was low, careful. "You don't have to do this, man." Keanu turned, meeting his gaze. "I know." But his eyes lingered on the piano. It wasn't about proving anything to Ethan Caldwell. It wasn't about social media or headlines or viral clips. This wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming something he had buried a lifetime ago. He could feel it building, a storm, a release, the way his fingers used to twitch when he passed a piano shop, the way a certain chord would play in his mind when the world got too loud. Keanu stepped forward. One foot, then the other. The crowd parted around him like water. Gasps echoed. Soft, sharp, uncertain. Phones were raised higher. Even Ethan, who had leaned back smugly just seconds before, straightened in sudden disbelief. The arrogant smirk cracked slightly. Keanu reached the piano. It gleamed beneath the ballroom chandelier. Black lacquer, perfectly polished. But he didn't sit yet. Instead, he placed a hand lightly on the edge, feeling its cool surface. He looked up, eyes sweeping the room. There were people he recognized. Journalists who'd written half-truths about him, executives who smiled too quickly, influencers who lived to twist stories. But they didn't matter. Then his gaze fell on the children's portraits lining the far wall, smiling faces from the music foundation he quietly supported. Kids who found healing in music, just like he once had. This moment wasn't about him anymore. It was for them. Keanu pulled the bench out. He sat down. And the room held its breath. Ethan tried to play it off, giving a sarcastic little bow, whispering something to a friend nearby. But even he couldn't hide the way his foot tapped anxiously on the floor. Keanu's fingers hovered over the keys. They trembled, not with fear, but with memory. He took a deep breath and began. The first notes were soft, hesitant, a gentle arpeggio that spilled into the room like sunlight through cracked curtains. It wasn't flash, it wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, soulful, honest. It was Chopin. No one spoke, not even Ethan. Keanu's shoulders loosened as the music carried him, each note guiding him further back into himself. It had been decades since his hands touched a piano like this, but they remembered. Somehow, they remembered. The pain, the beauty, the weight. It was all there. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman whispered, "He's really playing." Someone else dropped their phone. Keanu's foot pressed the pedal gently, drawing the notes out, weaving them like silk through the stunned silence. The ballroom transformed. There were no politics now, no cameras, no ridicule. Just a man and his music. The chords grew deeper, bolder. His fingers moved faster, sliding through transitions with aching precision. He wasn't showing off. He was opening up, and the room felt it. Ethan's smirk had vanished entirely. He crossed his arms, jaw tightening, unsure how to respond. This wasn't a performance he could outdo. It wasn't technical bravado. It was something else. Keanu hit the crescendo, a powerful swell of emotion that rolled through the ballroom like a wave. And suddenly, he wasn't 17 anymore. He wasn't grieving. He was healing. He slowed, letting the final notes drift into stillness. The last chord hung in the air for an eternity. Then, total reverent silence. No one clapped. No one dared move. Keanu lifted his hands from the keys, breathing slow and steady. He didn't stand. Didn't look at the crowd. He just sat there, calm, grounded, at peace. It was Marcus who finally whispered, "You did it." And the crowd erupted. Not in frenzy, but in stunned admiration. Applause rose slowly, spreading like a tide. A few began to cheer, then more. It wasn't loud, it wasn't explosive, but it was real. Even some of the skeptical faces in the crowd, critics, columnists, people who'd come to gawk, stood with reluctant awe. Ethan Caldwell didn't move. His eyes locked on Keanu, unreadable. He looked like a man who'd brought a sword to a poetry reading and realized too late he'd lost. Before the first word was even spoken, Keanu finally stood. He nodded once to no one in particular and stepped away from the piano. The moment would live on. It had already been captured. But in that instant, nothing else mattered. Not politics, not Twitter. Only truth. Only music. Only Keanu. Keanu Reeves stood motionless beside the grand piano, his hands resting gently at his sides. The room had fallen into an eerie hush. No one dared speak. No one moved. The same crowd that just moments ago buzzed with laughter and tension now waited, breath held, eyes locked on him. He didn't speak, not a single word. He simply slid onto the piano bench, his long fingers hovering just above the keys. The polished black surface reflected the weight in his expression, still, solemn, almost sacred, cameras lowered. Even Ethan Caldwell, who had been basking in his own arrogance, shifted uncomfortably. The first note he played was almost too soft to hear. It was Rachmaninoff's Elegy in E-flat minor, a piece of aching beauty and quiet heartbreak, one not meant to impress, but to speak. His fingers trembled slightly at first, unsure, as if reaching through decades of silence. It had been years since he'd touched a piano, not since the loss that tore through his life like fire. As a child, music had been Keanu's sanctuary. His mother, Patricia, had played piano in a dusty Toronto apartment, always classical, always emotional. When he was 7, she sat beside him on a worn bench, guiding his fingers across chipped ivory keys. He was quiet back then, often lost in his head, but music gave him words when he had none. His favorite composer? Rachmaninoff. Not because the pieces were hard, but because they felt like mourning and surviving all at once. He'd played Chopin at 16, Beethoven at 18, and on the night of his best friend's death, he played nothing. He walked away from it all. But now, in a gilded Beverly Hills ballroom surrounded by cynics, cameras, and people who thought silence meant weakness, he played again. The opening bars were hesitant, soft and sorrowful. His left hand grounded the piece with slow, deliberate chords, while his right hand whispered the melody like a memory too painful to speak aloud. People in the back stopped sipping their drinks. The servers froze. Ethan's smirk began to slip. As Keanu continued, the tremble in his fingers disappeared. They moved with grace, a rhythm built on scars. His eyes didn't scan the room. They were closed, brows furrowed in concentration or perhaps prayer. Each note spilled out like a confession, like the sobs he never let out at his friend's funeral. He didn't play for the crowd. He didn't play for pride. He played for the ones he had loved and lost. He played for Jennifer, the daughter he never held. For River Phoenix, his friend gone too soon. For his own younger self, the boy who believed beauty could still live in brokenness. The melody swelled, the chords deepened, and the room changed. Bones were lowered, not by demand but by awe. Nobody dared record. The moment felt too private, too human, too sacred to be repackaged as content. Influencers with millions of followers let their arms fall to their sides. Liberal critics, who'd chuckled earlier, now sat stunned, eyes glassy. Even Ethan stood still, the cocky glint in his eyes dimmed by something unfamiliar. Reverence. Keanu's posture straightened. His foot pressed the pedal. The piece moved into its middle passage, no longer hesitant, but haunting. A swirl of emotion so rich and raw, it filled the air with ghosts. The high notes sang like fading hope, and the low ones echoed with wounds never spoken. He wasn't performing. He was remembering. Rain on a hospital window, laughter over a campfire, a voicemail he couldn't bring himself to delete. This was Keanu Reeves, stripped of image, fame, or myth. This was the soul beneath the quiet. And now it was speaking. Somewhere in the room, a woman's breath hitched. A journalist dropped his pen. A child leaned on his mother's shoulder, eyes wide with wonder. The final section approached. Keanu leaned slightly forward, his fingers flying with gentle confidence. Not flashy, not dramatic, just true. He wasn't trying to win. He wasn't trying to prove Ethan wrong. He was reaching through years, through pain, through silence, to show the room, and maybe himself, that there were things inside him worth hearing. He struck the last note, a solitary tone that hovered in the air like smoke. And then, silence. No one moved, no one clapped, not yet. For a breathless second, it was as if time froze, as if the room had forgotten to exist outside of the music. Then, applause. Not a polite murmur, not a few claps from sympathetic guests. It began as a wave and then broke like a storm. Thunderous, relentless. The room exploded with standing ovations. Some clapped with open mouths, some with tears in their eyes, many with the kind of reverence usually reserved for church. Keanu sat still for a moment longer, his hands still resting on the keys, eyes still closed. When he stood, the applause didn't stop. Ethan Caldwell had fallen completely silent. His arms were crossed, but his jaw was tight. A woman near him muttered, "I wasn't ready for that." Ethan didn't reply. Keanu stepped away from the piano, his face calm, but something in his eyes had changed. There was no arrogance, no vindication, just peace. Maybe he hadn't expected that either. He walked back toward his friend Marcus, who stood clapping, lips parted in disbelief. Marcus leaned in and said, "You didn't have to do that, but I'm glad you did." Keanu gave the faintest nod, eyes scanning the crowd, now no longer smirking, no longer mocking, just watching. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The music had already said everything. The applause still thundered as Keanu Reeves stepped away from the grand piano. He didn't raise his arms, didn't bow, didn't bask in the moment. He simply offered a small nod and returned to his place near the back of the ballroom, his face composed, his presence as humble as when he arrived. But the energy in the room had changed. The people who had earlier whispered, judged, and smirked were now silent, watching him with an awe that felt almost sacred. Keanu had done what no press release, no interview, no viral soundbite could achieve. He had touched them. Ethan Caldwell, still standing a few steps from the piano, forced a thin smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. The smug confidence he wore earlier like cologne had evaporated. His fingers twitched at his side, betraying his unease. The plan had backfired, and everyone knew it. He tried to laugh. "Wow," Ethan said with a falsely bright tone. "Didn't know you had that in you, Keanu." A few guests glanced his way but said nothing. One woman, a fashion editor who'd known Ethan for years, arched an eyebrow, then turned her back on him entirely. The shift was that stark. From the far side of the room, a silver-haired man in a navy tuxedo stepped forward. The crowd parted as he moved, making way as though royalty walked among them. His name was Leonard Fraser, a Pulitzer-winning composer who had written symphonies for 5 presidents and conducted at Carnegie Hall. He stopped in front of Keanu and extended his hand. "That," Leonard said, voice graveled with emotion, wasn't acting. That was soul. Keanu met his eyes and shook his hand. "Thank you," he said simply. Leonard leaned in slightly. "I didn't know you could play like that. Or feel like that. Most people don't let it out." "I wasn't going to," Keanu replied, "but some moments ask for more than silence." The composer nodded, lingering for a moment before returning to his circle of stunned guests. The murmurs around him were no longer about celebrities or gossip or politics. They were about Keanu. Not the actor, not the myth. The man. Ethan, off to the side, watched this unfold with a tight jaw. His plan to humiliate Keanu had flipped into something he couldn't control. The spotlight he'd wielded like a weapon now shone elsewhere, and he was left in the shadows. He made one last attempt. Ethan strode to the microphone, tapping it once to draw attention. "You know," he began with a chuckle, "we came here tonight to support music for kids. I think it's great that even action stars are joining the cause, even if it means digging up old hobbies." A ripple of discomfort passed through the crowd. Marcus, Keanu's longtime friend, stepped forward just enough for Ethan to see him. He didn't say a word, just crossed his arms and stared. Ethan faltered. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. A Hollywood producer whispered to his assistant, "Does he realize how bad this looks?" But Ethan pressed on, voice rising slightly. "I mean, come on. It's not like the guy wrote the piece or anything." From near the back, a woman responded, "No, but he lived it." The room stilled. Ethan swallowed hard. For once, words failed him. Across the ballroom, Keanu remained quiet. He wasn't watching Ethan. He wasn't watching anyone. He was speaking softly with an elderly couple who donated to the foundation. They were smiling, hands over their hearts. There was no arrogance in his posture, no sense of triumph, just warmth and respect. Dozens of guests surrounded him now, not out of celebrity worship, but out of something deeper. They spoke to him in low voices, asking about the piece, about how he learned to play. Keanu answered gently, with humility, never once referencing Ethan or the earlier humiliation. He let the moment stand on its own. A liberal journalist, one who had come with snide intentions and a camera ready to catch a stumble, lowered his phone and whispered to a colleague, "I came to laugh. I'm leaving inspired." Others nodded. Even some who had doubted Keanu's sincerity earlier in the evening now looked at him differently, not as an icon, but as a reminder that truth doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers through music, through presence, through stillness. The event began to wind down, but the energy lingered. People milled about, reluctant to leave. Ethan stood alone near the wine bar, the crowd having peeled away from him like water off wax. One by one, even his friends drifted toward Keanu. He clenched his jaw and poured another glass of wine, but it didn't matter. The night had made its judgment. A little before midnight, Keanu quietly signaled Marcus. They exchanged a glance. No fanfare, no announcement, just a quiet decision to leave. They slipped through the side entrance of the ballroom. No red carpet, no photographers, only a valet attendant who looked up, startled, and stammered, "Mr. Reeves, that was incredible." Keanu smiled softly. "Thank you," he said. "Drive safe tonight." As the black car pulled away, Ethan stepped outside onto the empty balcony and leaned on the marble rail. He watched the taillights vanish down the hill, swallowed by the silence of midnight. Behind him, the echoes of Rachmaninoff still lingered in the air. The notes that had stunned the room still played in the minds of those who'd heard them. But for Ethan Caldwell, the sound was different. It was the sound of silence and defeat. The ballroom had long since emptied, but echoes of that single performance still lingered in the air like smoke after a quiet fire. Keanu Reeves had left without fanfare, slipping out through the kitchen exit with a quiet nod to the waitstaff who had stayed behind to clean. No entourage, no final wave to the crowd, just the soft tread of leather shoes disappearing into the night. but inside one guest remained frozen in place. Ethan Caldwell stood near the now silent grand piano, shoulders stiff, hands jammed deep into his pockets. The crowd's roar of applause still played in his mind, but it hadn't been for him. He had started the night with a smirk, fully expecting to humiliate a Hollywood actor in front of a room full of elites. Now he was left staring at the very stage he'd tried to weaponize, only to see it turned against him. What he didn't know was that someone, an intern with the foundation, had been quietly filming the entire exchange. From Ethan's mockery to Keanu's reluctant walk to the bench, and then that haunting performance. No commentary, no edits, just the moment as it happened. They posted it to social media with a simple caption. Hell, didn't say much. He didn't need to. By sunrise, it had already passed 1 million views. By noon, it was nearing 5. The video exploded across platforms. On X, users from both left and right reposted it. Liberal commentators who once mocked Keanu's stoicism now shared it, with captions like, "I didn't expect this. Absolute grace under fire." Conservative voices called it a masterclass in humility and quiet power, using hashtags like Reeves Redemption and Keanu Plays. Even music professionals joined the conversation. A Grammy-winning pianist wrote, "Forget acting, that man played like he lived through the music." Another said, "Rachmaninoff isn't easy, but Reeves didn't just play the notes, he meant them." Clips circulated globally. On TikTok, teens were remixing the performance into emotional reels. On Instagram, reels of his fingers trembling in the first few bars, then steadying, were overlaid with quotes about resilience, pain, and healing. The public couldn't get enough. But Keanu himself remained silent. He didn't comment, he didn't share, he didn't even like the video. Instead, he spent the next morning walking barefoot along the beach in Santa Monica, watching the sun rise over the Pacific. No one recognized him. That's how he preferred it. He had said what he needed to say the night before, without words. Back online, however, the fallout for Ethan Caldwell had begun. The same people who once cheered him on now accused him of arrogance, of turning art into a weapon. His name trended, but not for the reasons he wanted. When he finally responded, it was with a short, sarcastic post on X. "Didn't know piano could be a political stunt. Guess I need to cry softly on keys to go viral now." It backfired instantly. Replies poured in, calling him bitter, small, insecure. One read, "He played for something bigger than ego and you can't stand that." Another wrote, "Your smile faded. That's all we needed to see." Even a few of Ethan's fellow musicians distanced themselves, one tweeting, "There's a difference between confidence and cruelty." Ethan crossed that line last night. Within 24 hours, the conversation had shifted entirely. It was no longer about a showdown between an actor and a musician. It had become something much deeper, a conversation about humility, vulnerability, and what it truly means to carry grace in the face of ridicule. Meanwhile, journalists who had attended the gala began writing think pieces. One liberal columnist wrote, "I showed up expecting a Hollywood stunt. I left feeling humbled. Reeves didn't play to win. He played like he needed to remember something, and somehow we remembered something too." Another piece in The Atlantic asked, "Why did a single piano piece cut through so much noise?" Because in a world of shouting, Keanu reminded us how loud silence can be. Still, Keanu said nothing. When asked by a reporter the next day if he planned to speak on the performance, he shook his head gently and replied, "There's nothing to explain, it was just a song." But everyone watching knew it wasn't just a song. It was a reckoning. The piano had become more than an instrument that night. It had been a confession booth, a time machine, a bridge between grief and healing. And somehow, through the trembling keys and final soaring note, Keanu had told a story none of them could forget. Even in corners of the internet known for cynicism, people were admitting they were moved. A Reddit user wrote, "Not a Keanu fan, still not, but damn, that hit different." YouTube flooded with reaction videos, musicians, veterans, single moms, students, all explaining how something in that piece mirrored something in them. And in a world where actors are constantly selling something, tickets, projects, images, Keanu had done the impossible. He'd shared something real. But he didn't bask in it. He didn't try to milk the moment. He disappeared back into his quiet rhythm, long motorcycle rides, morning coffees, charity visits no one talks about. He wasn't interested in proving anything. He just wanted to play. Back in Beverly Hills, a few days after the gala, the foundation's director reached out. She thanked him, said the performance had already inspired a massive spike in donations and interest in music education. Keanu didn't respond immediately. But a week later, a grand piano was anonymously donated to a children's hospital in Los Angeles. A note was taped to the lid. It read, "Let the next note come from someone who needs it. No signature, no press release, just music, quietly passed forward." And that's what stayed with people. Not the applause, not the viral clips, but the truth in the act itself. Keanu Reeves didn't play to prove he could. He played because something inside him needed to be heard, and for one night, the world finally listened. The first donation came in quietly, a small gift of $25 with a note that read, "For the kids, because of Keanu." Then came 100 more, then thousands. Within a week of Keanu Reeves' haunting piano performance, the Children's Music Foundation he supported saw donations flood in from across the country. From Alabama to Oregon, Texas to Vermont, people opened their hearts and wallets. Teachers gave what they could, veterans sent letters with checks, some folded inside dog-eared photos. Parents wrote to say they watched the video with their children and then signed them up for piano lessons the next day. The total? Over $7 million in 6 days. It was unprecedented. The foundation's director, a reserved woman named Ava Lynn, found herself fielding non-stop phone calls from journalists, philanthropists, and music educators asking how they could help. "We've never seen anything like this," she told a reporter from NPR. "He didn't even say a word, he just played, and now the whole country wants their kids to play too." Keanu, of course, remained unreachable. He didn't respond to the interview requests. He declined every appearance. He turned down magazine covers, podcast offers, and even a request from a late-night talk show host who joked on air, "I don't care if he plays chopsticks or Rachmaninoff, just let the man play again." Instead, Keanu did what he always did. He disappeared into quiet. But even in the silence, something beautiful stirred. In a studio apartment in Cleveland, a single mother named Lacey watched the performance while feeding her newborn. She hadn't touched a piano in years. That night, she pulled out the old Yamaha keyboard from her closet and placed her baby on a blanket beside it. Her fingers stumbled over the keys, rusty and hesitant. But she played anyway. In a rural Idaho school, a music teacher played Keanu's video to a class of 7th graders. He was scared, the teacher told them, but he played through it. That's what courage sounds like. Kids who once shrugged at sheet music now begged to learn. Local music stores reported shortages of beginner piano books and digital keyboards. Lessons were fully booked. Even more surprising, the letters. Keanu began receiving handwritten notes, forwarded through the foundation. Some were from children, their penmanship shaky, but their words full of awe. "Dear Mr. Reeves, I didn't know you played piano. I thought actors just acted, but now I want to learn because you looked so calm." Others came from adults. "My son watched your video 5 times. He has autism and rarely sits still, but he did for that. He started humming your song yesterday. Thank you." One letter, though, stood out. It was written in elegant cursive on thick stationery. "Dear Mr. Reeves, I am writing from a hospice center in Montana. I don't have long, but I wanted you to know. That song you played, Rachmaninoff's Elegy, it reached me. My daughter played that piece before she passed. Hearing it again, I don't have the words, but I felt her in the room. I don't expect a reply. I just wanted to say thank you. With love, Mary M. Brooks. Keanu read the letter in silence, alone in his home. When he finished, he placed it beside an old photo of himself and his sister. He stared at it for a long time. The next morning, he made a quiet call. He didn't tell anyone where he was going, not even Marcus. That afternoon, in a children's hospital in downtown LA, a nurse walked into the pediatric oncology unit and found a man sitting at the piano in the corner. He wore a beanie, a scarf tucked beneath his chin, and a long coat. His fingers danced softly over the keys. The children listened. Some lay in beds, tubes in arms, eyes wide. Others curled in their parents' laps. There was no fanfare, no introduction, just music. One child, a girl of 8 named Bella, whispered, "He sounds like a dream." The nurse didn't say a word. She simply sat beside Bella and listened. Keanu left before anyone could stop him. But he returned the next week. And the week after that. He began visiting other hospitals too. Sometimes he played in the early morning, when most patients were still asleep. Other times late at night, when only the cleaning staff remained. He never told the media. He never asked for recognition. In fact, most didn't even realize it was him. He was just a man with a piano, playing for those who needed something they couldn't name. Word, of course, eventually spread. A nurse from a recovery center in Phoenix posted a photo of the mystery pianist from behind, with the caption, "Hell never says his name, but when he plays, the whole ward goes quiet. Even the walls listen." Fans began piecing it together. Whispers turned to confirmation. And yet, no one tried to invade the sanctity of those moments. No cameras, no autographs, just silent reverence. Even Ethan Caldwell, still licking his wounds from the gala night, began seeing the impact. One of his longtime fans tweeted, "I came to that event thinking Keanu was a Hollywood puppet. I left thinking he was a prophet with a piano. Ethan tried to win. Keanu changed lives." Another replied, "Ethan lost that night, but the rest of us, we gained something better." A week later, Ethan made an unexpected move. He donated $10,000 to the same music foundation under a pseudonym. Someone leaked it anyway. When asked by a friend why he did it, Ethan said simply, "Because sometimes you get beat by someone better, and sometimes that makes you better." He didn't tweet about it, he didn't post, but the gesture spoke volumes. And Keanu? He never mentioned Ethan again. He never needed to. Instead, he kept showing up at the places no one expected. An addiction recovery center in Oakland, a trauma support group in Denver, a small-town church in Kentucky that hadn't heard live piano in over a decade. He played the same song every time, not because he was showing off, but because it had become a part of him, a way to speak when words weren't enough. And the world kept listening. Even now, months later, the ripple hasn't stopped. The foundation continues to grow, supporting new music programs in underserved communities. More kids have pianos than ever before. Schools that once cut their arts programs are bringing them back. All because one man chose not to walk away from a challenge meant to humiliate him, but to turn it into something holy. Keanu didn't reclaim his past. He transformed it. And in doing so, he reminded us all, sometimes the quietest voice leaves the loudest echo. It was a cloudy Thursday morning when Keanu Reeves returned to the old community center tucked between faded apartment blocks and cracked sidewalks in East Hollywood. Years ago, in his early 20s, when his fame was still budding and his heart still bruised from personal losses, this place had offered him refuge. Not from fans or cameras, but from silence. It was here, years back, where an aging volunteer named Mrs. Hathaway first let him sit at the dusty upright piano in the back corner, never asking who he was, just handing him a rag and saying, "If you clean it, you can play it." That old piano was still there. The keys were chipped, one was missing, but the bench hadn't moved, and the room smelled the same, of dust, crayons, and warmth. The walls were covered with children's art, most of it proudly taped at odd angles. A poster reading "Creativity Heals" hung above the stage. Keanu hadn't planned to return, not after everything, not after the viral video, but something had shifted deep inside him. The night at the gala hadn't been a performance, it was a release. And in the days that followed, with messages pouring in, some from strangers and others from people bearing their souls, he'd started to remember something he'd buried. Music wasn't just escape, it was communion. He walked in quietly, just as he had at the gala. No fanfare, no cameras, just a black hoodie and jeans. Marcus was already there, speaking softly with the center's director. When he saw Keanu enter, he stepped back and watched. Keanu approached the piano slowly. He ran his hand along the wood. The finish had faded, and there were deep scratches from years of use, or maybe abuse. But when he lifted the lid and pressed a key, it still sang. Slightly flat, a little metallic, but alive. He kneeled down, pulling a small toolkit from his backpack. He'd learned piano tuning during his downtime filming in Berlin years ago. A strange hobby, but one that soothed him. For the next hour, he gently worked on the instrument, tuning strings, testing hammers, occasionally stopping to close his eyes and hum. Children started drifting in. At first, they were curious, watching the quiet man with the kind eyes working patiently. Some recognized him, others didn't. But none approached. They simply watched from the hallway, whispering. Eventually, one boy stepped forward. He was maybe 10, with curly hair and a nervous smile. "Mister, are you fixing it so we can use it?" Keanu looked up and nodded. "Yeah, pianos should be played, not left to gather dust." The boy looked at the keys. "My dad used to play before he got sick. I don't remember much, but I remember the sound." Keanu's eyes softened. He stood, motioned to the bench. "Sit. Try it." The boy hesitated. "I don't know how." "You don't need to, just press something." The boy slowly sat, tapped a few notes. Keanu watched him, then smiled. Every great pianist started with one note. He didn't stay long in the background. Once the tuning was finished, he sat down and began to play. Not Rachmaninoff this time, but something simpler, a piece he wrote when he was 15 and never named. It was soft, meditative, and full of pauses. The room fell still. The children stopped whispering. Some sat cross-legged on the floor. A little girl crawled closer and rested her chin on the piano's side. A teenage boy who'd been scrolling his phone in the back pocketed it and leaned against the wall, listening. Marcus watched all of it. From the doorway, arms crossed, tears forming in his eyes. He'd seen Keanu through battles, losses no man should have to endure. He knew the weight his friend carried. And he also knew Keanu never wanted the spotlight. That was never the goal. This, though, this moment was pure. After the final note faded, Keanu sat for a long time in silence. He didn't turn around. He simply rested his hands in his lap. Then a small voice broke the stillness. "Why do you play like that?" the boy with curly hair asked. "Like you're thinking about something far away." Keanu looked over his shoulder, smiling gently. "Because someone once did that for me, and I never forgot how it felt." The boy nodded, as if understanding something deeper than words. From the back, a few parents had now gathered. One wiped her eye, another filmed, but not for social media, just to remember. Keanu stood slowly, giving the keys one last soft stroke. He didn't need applause. He didn't need recognition. He needed only this. A reminder that music could build bridges over grief. That the piano wasn't a place of performance, but a sanctuary. The children clapped, not loudly, but sincerely. Keanu chuckled softly and bowed his head, then stepped away to help a little girl climb onto the bench. She pressed a few uncertain keys and giggled at the sound. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, Keanu and Marcus sat on the steps outside the center. Kids' laughter echoed faintly behind them. Marcus nudged him. "That boy? You changed something for him today?" Keanu didn't answer right away. He looked toward the horizon, the same worn backpack at his feet. Finally, he said, "Music saved me more than once. I just gave a little of it back." Marcus smiled. "You've always done that, quietly. No one ever sees it. And that's how I like it." The headlines were still swirling online. Keanu plays with soul. Hollywood's quiet hero. Even, is he the most human celebrity alive? But Keanu hadn't read a single one. He didn't need to. The moment had already done what it needed to do. He'd shown the world, not through a speech or a tweet, but through 88 keys and a few honest notes, that art was never about winning, it was about reaching. Back inside, the old upright piano echoed again, now under the hands of a curious child. It wasn't perfect, but it was alive, and so was he. Keanu Reeves never clapped back. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't post a reply. He didn't drop a quote or a clever retort. He just played. In a room filled with influencers, journalists, critics, and ego, he sat at a piano and let his hands speak a truth far louder than any words could reach. That night, he didn't just silence a man who mocked him. He silenced a room conditioned to reward arrogance. He quieted the inner voices telling him not to go back, not to risk it, not to show vulnerability. And when he walked away, he left behind something far more powerful than a viral moment. He left behind an example. Because Keanu wasn't playing to win. He was playing to remember. To remember the mother who taught him his first scale. To remember the quiet nights when music was the only thing that made sense in a chaotic world. To remember the friend he lost. The one who once said, "You're better than you think." He was playing for the kid inside himself. The one who didn't want the spotlight. The one who just wanted the music to mean something. And it did. The truth is, in a world where everyone's talking, where social feeds overflow with opinions, sarcasm, and sound bites, it's easy to think that loudness equals power, that if you're not the one clapping back, if you're not shouting the loudest, then you're losing. But Keanu showed us the opposite. He showed us that real power often moves in silence, that strength doesn't always roar, that healing can come from a single, trembling note played with sincerity. He didn't need to prove anything, but he did remind us of something we forget too often. Your worth is not measured by their applause, not the applause of a smug critic, not the clapping of an internet mob, not the cheers or jeers of strangers who don't know your story. Your worth is rooted in how you live when no one's watching, in how you rise when challenged, not by flexing, but by standing firm in who you are. Ethan Caldwell learned that lesson the hard way. He came into that ballroom expecting a takedown. He wanted to embarrass someone he saw as quiet, maybe even beneath him. But what he got instead was a masterclass in grace. Ethan was loud, but Keanu was unshakable. Ethan played to perform, Keanu played to remember. And the crowd? They saw the difference. Because they didn't just see a Hollywood star touch a piano. They saw a man confront a part of himself he'd buried for decades and bring it back to life. Not for attention, not for clout, but for meaning. That's the part that stuck. That's why it went viral. Not because Keanu played perfectly, but because he played truthfully. And it hit a nerve. It reminded people of their own quiet passions, their shelved dreams, their talents they let go because someone once told them they weren't good enough, or because life got in the way. It reminded them that it's never too late to reclaim who you are. So here's the real takeaway. You don't need permission to be brilliant. You don't need approval to show up fully. You don't need to clap back when someone underestimates you. Let your work do the talking. Let your gifts rise when it matters. Let your silence carry weight. Because when you show up with truth, it's always louder than the noise around you. And when they laugh, when they mock, when they doubt, do what Keanu did. Take a breath. Take your place. And let your soul speak louder than their assumptions. That's what happened on that piano bench. A quiet man, didn't defend himself. He didn't play to impress. He played to reconnect with something deeper than ego, deeper than pride, deeper than the moment. And in doing so, he reminded us all, you are not your critics. You are your courage, your authenticity, your resilience, your truth. That's the music that stays with people. That's the legacy that matters. So whatever your piano is, whether it's a dream you've hidden, a voice you've silenced, or a part of you you've let go of, don't wait for the world to believe in it first. Stop. Show up, even if your hands shake, because someone out there needs your story. Someone out there needs your strength. And someone out there needs to see that being underestimated isn't the end. It's the beginning. Now it's your turn. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever stayed quiet when the world told you to shout, if you've ever found your strength in stillness, drop one in the comments and share your story. We want to hear it, because your truth might be the song someone else is waiting to hear. And if you felt something tonight, if Keanu's story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell. There's more where this came from.